Hey there, horror fans. Welcome back to another episode of Real Talk Horror Edition. I'm your host, Josh Bell, and I'm here to guide you into the twisted, terrifying, and sometimes downright bizarre world of horror cinema. Whether you're here to get chills or to chuckle at some good old campy horror, you've come to the right place. Each episode, we dig into the shadows, exploring everything from cult classics to modern scarefests, all in the hope of answering that ultimate question. Does this film deliver the fright or fall flat? Today we're diving into a lesser-known cult classic that brings us back to the blood-splattered days of 80s horror, packed with camp, chaos, and more than a few moments of over-the-top acting that practically scream retro horror. So let's get into it. If you're new here, welcome to Real Talk, the podcast where we dissect horror from every angle. Here we go beyond the surface to look at plot structure, character arcs, themes, cinematography, sound design, and all the elements that come together to create horror experience. Some movies hit you with that relentless, spine-tingling dread. Others bring a lighthearted comedic approach that makes you laugh in between the scares. And of course, there are the films that walk that fine line in between, delivering both shivers and laughs. By the end of each episode, we'll break down whether the film in question is a chilling masterpiece or a misstep in the world of horror. So what's on the docket today? Well, it's all about embracing the fun side of horror, the campy, self-aware, and utterly unapologetic world of Return to Horror High. This isn't your typical slasher flick. Instead, it's a movie that's in on the joke, packed with cheesy dialogue, over-the-top characters, and plenty of wink and nod moments for horror fans. It knows exactly what it's doing and leans into it with gusto. So grab your popcorn, settle in, because we're about to break down this 80s horror gem from start to finish. Join me as we head back to high school. But trust me, this is no ordinary homecoming. Alright, horror fans, let's take a trip back to 1987, smack in the middle of the 80s horror boom, when movies weren't afraid to get a little weird. A lot campy, and just plain fun. Enter Return to Horror High, a quirky horror comedy that took the slasher genre in a delightfully unexpected direction. This film follows a ragtag film crew as they head to the infamous Crippen High School to shoot a horror movie about a series of brutal murders that happened there a few years earlier. They're hoping for authenticity by filming on the very grounds where the real horrors took place. A classic bad idea, right? It's the perfect recipe for a spooky set, and the crew is eager to dive into the grisly past, hoping to capture that eerie, true crime vibe. But as they dig deeper, things take a dark turn, and it quickly becomes clear that someone or something has more in store for them than just a film shoot. What starts out as a routine production turns into a meta nightmare, blurring the lines between what's being filmed and what's actually happening. The movie plays with your expectations, jumping between that movie within a movie scenes and what's unfolding on set. So you're constantly questioning where the fiction ends and reality begins. And here's where Return to Horror High stands out. It's not your typical slasher film. Sure, there are plenty of scares, but this one mixes horror, comedy, and mystery in a way that feels more like a love letter to the genre itself. It's satirical, self-aware, and so over the top that it practically winks at the audience with every scene. It doesn't take itself too seriously. Instead, it revels in horror tropes and cheesy dialogue, all wrapped in a package that feels just as wild and unpredictable as the decade itself. So if you're looking for a film that defies slasher conventions and doesn't mind getting a little ridiculous along the way, Return to Horror High is exactly that. It's fun, chaotic, and full of surprises that'll keep you guessing and laughing all the way through. Alright, so let's sink our teeth into the plot of the Return to Horror High. This is one of those movies where the plot is just as chaotic and quirky as the tone, and that's both a strength and at times a head-scratcher. The story moves between two main threads. The film crew's on-set antics as they try to capture the horrors of Crippen High on camera, and flashbacks to the original horrific murders that went down years before. This back-and-forth structure gives the movie a kind of dreamlike quality. One moment you're watching the crew's overly staged, cheesy reenactment, and the next you're plunged into a darker, almost surreal memory of the actual killings. It's like being in two movies at once, and while that can be disorienting, it's part of what makes Return to Horror High such an oddball experience. Instead of a clean, linear story, you get this patchwork of scenes that feels kind of like a puzzle. Now the pacing, let's just say it's also unpredictable. This movie isn't here to build a slow, suspenseful crescendo. Instead, it's more of a wild roller coaster ride that tosses you from one scene to the next without a breather in between. But that's also what makes it fun. Rather than building the kind of dread that'll have you biting your nails, Return to Horror High goes for an offbeat mix of scares and laughs that feels refreshingly playful. It knows it's cheesy, and it totally leans into that with moments that are so over the top, you can't help but laugh as much as you're spooked. Think more haunted house with friends than night alone in a dark room vibes. You're in on the joke, which adds a whole level of enjoyment. And what really sets this movie apart is that self-awareness. This isn't just a horror movie, it's a satire, almost a parody of the entire genre of horror. The film takes every trope, every cliché you can think of, screaming co-eds, ominous janitors, shady authority figures, and cranks them up to 11. It's like the filmmakers are nodding to us and saying, hey, we know these horror tropes are ridiculous, and we're going to have a blast with them. They're playing with the very elements that most of the horror movies use seriously, and that meta approach makes Return to Horror High a kind of playful mockery of horror itself. You'll find yourself laughing at the absurdity and enjoying how fully the film commits to its campy concept. So if you're someone who loves seeing horror clichés twisted for a good laugh, or you're looking for a slasher film that doesn't take itself seriously, this movie is the perfect watch. It's like the horror genre took a look in the mirror, saw all its quirks, and just decided to have a laugh at itself. Alright, horror buffs, let's talk about the characters and the acting, which is practically a character in itself in Return to Horror High. First off, we've got a fun surprise. George Clooney himself in one of his earliest on-screen roles. Seeing him as a young, fresh-faced actor in a campy horror flick is like finding a hidden gem. And let's just say he brings a surprising amount of charisma to the role, even in the few scenes that he's actually in the film. It's a little surreal seeing him here, but Clooney's appearance is just the beginning of what makes the cast such a fun watch. The movie doesn't go for subtlety, and neither does the cast. The ensemble here is clearly dialed up to the max, with every line delivered like they're in on some giant inside joke. From the ambitious director to the wide-eyed scream queens, each character is more of a horror archetype than a fully realized person. And that's exactly what makes this work. The actors lean into these tropes with all they've got. They're going from melodramatic to downright absurd in a way that just adds to the film's charm. They're not here to create layered, realistic characters. They're here to bring these caricatures to life. And they do it with this kind of fearless, no-holds-barred approach. Take the characters themselves. Each one feels like a wink to the audience. We've got the cynical producer, the creepy janitor, the ditzy but determined actress, and the no-nonsense cops. Instead of trying to break these characters out of their usual modes, the movie amps them up and makes them ridiculous in the best ways possible. It's almost like the cast is saying, yeah, we know we're stereotypes, but we're going to have a blast anyways. And you know what? That enthusiasm is contagious. You end up rooting for these characters. Not because they're relatable or complex, but because they're so committed to the absurdity of it all. As for character development, Well, let's just say this isn't a movie that worries about deep backstories or any emotional growth. These characters are here for the chaos, the screams, the laughs, and they deliver on all of that. The exaggerated performances capture the spirit of the film perfectly, and even though they are over the top, they feel right at home in a movie that's all about poking fun at itself. So if you're looking for grounded, nuanced characters, you won't find that here. But if you're up for a cast that's having just as much fun as you are, Return to Horror High has exactly that. Okay, so let's talk themes. Now, I know Return to Horror High doesn't exactly scream deep philosophical horror, but beneath all the cheesy one-liners and over-the-top acting, there's actually some clever commentary here. It's a film that slyly pokes fun at Hollywood's obsession with violence and the bigger, bloodier, better approach that horror often takes. This movie essentially holds up a mirror to the horror genre and exaggerates everything that makes horror films an easy target. The reliance on gore, the sensationalism, the clichés, and even the stereotypical characters. It's all dialed up to remind us just how predictable and sometimes ridiculous these tropes can actually be. In a way, it's a film that winks at the audience while saying, hey, we know this is ridiculous and you love it. This meta approach makes Return to Horror High a kind of precursor to the self-aware horror films that come later. Think about Scream, which famously dissected horror tropes a decade later. This movie does something similar, just in a much more chaotic, over-the-top way. It's like it's in on its own joke, taking each horror trope and cranking it up just shows how absurd some of these elements are. The film also throws in a bit of commentary on the exploitation of real-life tragedies for entertainment. You've got this film crew turning a gruesome high school murder into a low-budget horror flick, complete with fake blood and exaggerated gore. It's a not-so-subtle jab at Hollywood's habit of sensationalizing true crime and horror to make a quick buck. There's this underlying message about how far the industry will go for a good scare, even if it means cashing in on something really horrifying. It's a little uncomfortable when you think about it, but that's exactly the point. So while Return to Horror High isn't exactly a thesis on the human condition, it's got this layer of satire that's pretty sharp if you're looking for it. It's a movie that knows exactly what kind of film it is, campy, over the top, self-aware. And it uses that to comment on the very genre it belongs to. It's horror making fun of horror, all wrapped up in an intentionally cheesy package. So if you're watching closely, there's actually a bit of substance behind all the satire and fake blood. It's like the filmmakers were having a laugh with us, while also saying, hey, maybe it's time we think about what we're really consuming here. Right, so let's talk about the look and feel of Return to Horror High. The cinematography here won't blow anyone away, but there's a certain charm to the way the film leans into its classic horror visuals. Picture those dimly lit classrooms, sprawling hallways, and the unmistakable abandoned high school vibe that feels like it could be haunted by any number of 80s movie villains. There's something about the way they bring that setting to life that feels both familiar and unsettling. It's a perfect playground for horror. The set design nails that creepy, run-down look. It's not exactly extravagant, but every corner of the high school seems like it could be hiding a secret. And that works for the film's low-budget, DIY horror style. It's got that gritty, VHS quality charm that we associate with horror films from the era. And even though there aren't any jaw-dropping effects or groundbreaking shots, the visuals carry this grungy, unpolished vibe that actually adds to the campy and unsettling tone. And don't expect any flashy camera work or any fancy special effects here. The cinematography plays it straight, mostly sticking to basic horror techniques, lots of close-ups to capture the actors' wild expressions, and those dark, shadowy hallways that make you want to squint at the screen, wondering what might jump out. The lighting, or lack thereof, adds to the mystery, keeps you guessing about what might be lurking in the dark corners of the creepy school. It's low budget, sure, but they make it work in their favor. The underlit look helps build a kind of claustrophobic feeling, almost as if the darkness is swallowing everything up, one of the scenes at a time. One thing I do appreciate is how the film uses its visuals to amplify its parody of horror tropes. There's an almost exaggerated sense of menace in certain scenes, like the cameras lingering on blood-splattered lockers or a gruesome prop that looks just a bit too fake. These moments are so over the top that it feels like the film, again, visually winking at us. It's almost as if the cinematography, it too, is in on this joke, emphasizing just how ludicrous some of these horror set pieces really are. You can tell the filmmakers had fun playing with the genre's visual cliches. Now, so while Return to Horror High doesn't exactly push the boundaries of horror cinematography, it creates a setting that's perfectly in line with its campy tone. The film's grainy, unpolished look isn't a flaw here, it's a feature. It captures that vintage horror feel of the 80s, where every darkened hallway and flickering light feels like it could lead somewhere bizarre and unexpected. It's not the prettiest horror movie you'll watch, but it's got just enough visual personality to pull you into this ridiculous and maybe spooky world. So let's talk sound, because in a movie like Return to Horror High, it plays a huge role in crafting that over-the-top, campy vibe we've been talking about. The score here is exactly what you'd expect from an 80s horror flick. Dark, suspenseful, and leaning into those dramatic synths that were practically a horror staple back in the day. Sure, it may sound a bit dated to modern ears, but there's a certain charm to it. It's the kind of score that almost telegraphs the scares, letting you know that something big is coming with a crescendo or that sudden high-pitched note. It's not subtle, but then this movie doesn't exactly do subtle. The sound effects, though, there's something else. Every scream, stab, and footstep seems to be amplified, as if the movie's daring you not to jump. But instead of being terrifying, these kind of end up being more comical sounds. It's like the filmmakers took every sound effect knob in the studio, cranked it all the way up, and then there's that exaggerated quality here that doesn't so much scare you as make you laugh. The blood splatter sound effects, for example, are just ridiculously overdone. Almost like someone threw a bucket of water against a wall. It's like the sound itself is adding to the joke and the overall camp factor. One of my favorite things, though, is how the sound design plays up the parody element. In a way, the score and effects almost feel like they're poking fun at horror conventions. For instance, you've got these intense, ominous notes playing during the scenes that aren't exactly scary, almost like the music's trying to convince you that something terrifying is happening when it's just not. It's like the movie saying, hey, we know this is ridiculous, and we're going to make sure you hear it too. That's part of what makes it so fun. It's a horror comedy that's more interested in making you laugh than making you scream, and the sound design plays a big role here. Now, where the sound design could have added a bit more dimension is in the moments between the chaos. There's almost no quiet, suspenseful buildup here, which could have added some nice contrast. Instead, it's all loud all the time. Don't get me wrong, the constant barrage of overdone effects adds to the film's campy vibe, but a few moments of genuine tension would have given the scares a bit more bite. It would have been interesting if they dialed back occasionally, creating that eerie silence or subtle background noise that can be just as unsettling as any jump scare. In other words, it's missing that little bit of breathing room to build suspense before going full throttle again with the sound. So overall, the sound and music fit right in with the film's outrageous self-aware tone. It's all about those loud, jolting sounds that hit you over the head, rather than sneaking up on you. And while it may not be everyone's cup of tea, that exaggerated, in-your-face approach adds to the cheesy charm. It's like the sound design itself is as much of a character as anyone else in the movie, reinforcing the blend of horror and humor that makes it such a unique watch. Now, when it comes to pacing, Return to Horror High is a bit of a mixed bag. The pacing isn't smooth, it's really uneven, sometimes lingering a little too long on scenes that don't necessarily add to the story, especially in that middle portion, that second act. You can feel that drag setting in as the movie pauses here and there to deliver bits of character exposition or quirky side plots. It's like the film can't decide if it wants to be a full throttle horror comedy or if it's trying to squeeze in these side stories that don't entirely fit. But despite that, the slow parts almost add to the film's oddball charm, creating that "what did I just watch" feeling that campy cult classics thrive on. And then there's the editing. I've got to say the editing is all over the place, but again, in the best way possible. The cuts are choppy, almost chaotic, and just when you think you're following one storyline, the film jumps to a completely different thread, throwing you off balance. This might sound like a flaw, but in most movies it would be, but here the rough transitions kind of actually work. They keep you disoriented, which is exactly what this movie wants. It's almost like the editing itself is messing with you, reminding you that nothing here is straightforward or serious. You'll go from tense horror movie setup to laugh out loud moment in the blink of an eye, with edits that feel almost jarring. One of the interesting things about the choppy editing style is how it adds to this movie's meta horror vibe. It's as if the filmmakers are winking at the audience, saying, "Yeah, we know this makes no sense." And again, that's the point. Each cut, each oddly timed scene shift adds to the self-aware chaos. And let's not forget that the back and forth between the film's crew's experiences and the flashbacks of the actual murders keeps you guessing about what's real and what's part of the movie they're making. This disorienting style is almost like its own character, adding to the layered effects of the story within a story and the blurred lines between fiction and reality. But in the final act, though, the pacing really picks up. It's like the film suddenly remembers it's a horror movie and throws everything it's got at you. Characters are running, there's more action, and the cuts come fast and furious. This frenetic editing just really ramps up alongside the chaos, creating this frantic energy that adds to the sense of impending doom. Though, of course, it's all still done with that cheeky, campy kind of flair. By the end, the pacing and editing come together in a way that almost feels like coming to a punchline, tying up the mayhem with a little bow. It may not be traditional or seamless, but it works for the kind of experience this film is offering. So yeah, the pacing and editing are not polished, but that again is what makes Return to Horror High such an oddball gem. The choppiness, the uneven pace, and the unpredictable transitions all contribute to this sense of wild, chaotic energy. It's a film that's constantly tripping over itself in kind of a good way, keeping you on your toes and reminding you that you probably shouldn't be taking any of this seriously. In the end, the pacing and editing add to the disorienting offbeat vibe, making the movie an enjoyable, if bumpy, ride from start to finish. Now let's talk about the scare factor and the gore in Return to Horror High. If you're tuning in looking for spine-chilling scares or heart-pounding moments of terror, you might want to adjust your expectations. Is it scary? Not in the traditional sense. Instead, what this film serves up is a delightful blend of comedic scares that are more likely to elicit laughter than screams. The film really knows how to play with your expectations, using classic horror setups only to subvert them with a punchline or a goofy twist that catches you off guard in the best way possible. When it comes to gore, Return to Horror High definitely delivers. There are some memorable moments of splatter that cater to horror enthusiasts who appreciate a little blood and guts. However, it never reaches the extreme levels of horror you might find in other slasher flicks. The gore here feels more like a playful nod to the genre than any attempt to shock or disturb. Think of it as the comic book version of horror. It's colorful, exaggerated, and almost cartoonish in its approach. The blood is bright red, the killings are often staged with an absurd flair, and it never feels like the stakes are too high. You're not going to leave this film feeling traumatized. Rather, you'll be laughing at the ridiculousness of it all. One of the standout aspects of the film is how it balances its comedic elements with those moments of gore. It's as if the filmmakers keep saying, we know this is horror, but we're here to have a good time. There's a certain charm in watching characters get attacked in outlandish ways that would feel horrific in a different context, but come across as almost hilarious here. It creates a unique viewing experience where the audience can appreciate the camp without feeling the weight of true horror. You'll find yourself laughing at the absurdity of it all rather than hiding behind your couch. The combination of these comedic scares and lighthearted gore really sets Return to Horror High apart from its contemporaries. Instead of relying on tension and fear, it opts for a style that celebrates the absurdity of the horror genre. This self-aware approach makes it accessible, even for those who might not typically enjoy horror. You can sit back, enjoy the wild ride, laugh at the ridiculousness without the threat of nightmares following you into your sleep. Ultimately, if you're in the mood for something that combines horror and humor, Return to Horror High is your go-to flick. It's less about being scared and more about enjoying the spectacle. So grab your popcorn, kick back, and prepare for a good time, because this is a movie that thrives on fun rather than fear. You might not jump out of your seat, but you'll certainly get a good chuckle as you watch the chaos unfold. So let's wrap up our exploration of Return to Horror High. I rated a 5 out of 10. It sits comfortably in that middle ground of being entertaining while also being delightfully absurd. This film is a quirky, campy piece of 80s horror that embraces its silliness without reservation. It's not trying to be a profound horror masterpiece or push boundaries. Instead, it revels in the chaotic charm that defined the era. You're not going to walk away feeling deeply disturbed or haunted by the experience, which is refreshing in its own right. Instead, it offers a lighthearted romp through the genre, one that allows you to kick back and enjoy the ride without taking it too seriously. What really stands out is how the film knows exactly what it is. It's a self-aware parody of horror tropes. And while it does deliver some laugh-out-loud moments, it also keeps things light and breezy. It's the kind of movie that makes you appreciate the fun of horror rather than the fear of it. Whether you're a die-hard horror fan or someone just looking to indulge in some nostalgic 80s vibes, this film delivers just enough blood and guts combined with a hefty dose of humor to keep you entertained from start to finish. So if you're into campy horror that doesn't take itself too seriously, then Return to Horror High is absolutely worth a watch. This is the kind of movie you throw on with friends for a night of laughs, popcorn, and maybe a few mock screams as you all react to the over-the-top antics on screen. It's perfect for those who appreciate the charm of low-budget filmmaking and the fun of cheesy dialogue and melodramatic performances. So I say gather your friends, grab some snacks, and get ready to enjoy a film that will have you laughing and shaking your head at the sheer ridiculousness of it all. And remember, it's all about the experience. Embrace the absurdity, enjoy the camp, and let yourself be entertained. Whether you're a seasoned horror aficionado or a casual viewer, Return to Horror High promises a good time, so pop it in, let the laughter flow, and enjoy this delightful ride through a world where horror meets hilarity. Alright, listeners, I want to hear from you. What do you think about Return to Horror High? Have you seen it? Did you relish the campy horror vibe? Or did the cheesiness take you out of the experience? I'd love to know your thoughts. Your feedback is what makes this community great. You can always email me at therealrealtalk@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Threads at realrealtalk. Don't be shy, drop us a comment. Let's dive deep into the horror genre together, share our opinions, and discuss our favorite flicks. So whether you love the absurdity of Return to Horror High or thought it was just too much, I'm excited to hear your take. Engaging with fellow horror fans is one of the best parts of this journey, and your insights might just spark the next episode topic. So reach out and let's keep the horror conversation alive. Now here's a little tease for our next episode. We're switching gears and heading back into truly terrifying territory as we delve into the sinister world of Sinister. That's right, we're focusing on the sequel this time, Sinister 2. If you're ready for some spine-tingling, supernatural horror, you won't want to miss it. Prepare yourselves for the darkness that awaits, because things are about to get intense. Grab your popcorn and settle in for another thrilling ride. And thanks for tuning in to Real Talk Horror Edition. Your support means the world, and I appreciate every one of you. So don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review us wherever you get your podcast. Your reviews help spread the word and bring more horror fans into our fold. And remember, folks, until next time, stay creepy. Keep those lights on and those blankets close, because you never know what lurks in the shadows. See you in the next episode.